Welcome to the Classic Spotlight on the Studer A800. We're going to be focusing on and doing a deep dive on the specifically the UAD Studer plugin, but the actual machine as well. So let's start with a tiny bit of background on this machine. Studer is a company from Zurich, Switzerland, and they became famous for making extremely well-made tape machines like a Swiss watch. If you ever look inside of one of these machines, it's insane how much detail and engineering goes into them. Probably the first one that was extremely well recognized was the J37, which you can get an emulation of from Waves. That came out in 1964, and that was the machine that the Beatles used to record Sgt. Pepper. It was a 4-track machine. Before that, they were basically 2-track machines, and even earlier, they were mono machines. The earliest ones came out in the late 40s, and they were actually kind of rebranded American machines, where Willie Studer took American-made machines that were made by the Brush Company. The machine was called the Sound Mirror, and he customized them and made them extremely reliable for studio use. And he originally called those the Dynavox and then the Revox. So Revox as a name is actually older than Studer. He started making studio machines under his name a little bit later. So that first machine that he came out with, the Revox T26, was a mono machine. And then he got into 2-track machines, and then later on started making those 4-track machines. So the J37 was made famous in use at EMI and a lot of other big name studios around the mid 60s. Everybody recorded on those until about 1970 when the A80 came out. Now the A80 machine was super famous as well. They used them at EMI and Abbey Road. That was the machine that recorded Dark Side of the Moon, all the Zappa records back then, Alan Parsons Project, 10cc, tons and tons of music. In 1978, the new version of that architecture came out, which was the A800. And that was a huge deal, a big time deal, because that was the first machine that was microprocessor controlled. Every aspect of the unit from top to bottom was microprocessors, which meant that you could edit quickly, you could move around quickly without breaking things, without losing your place. And not only that, you actually had a lower noise floor on that machine as well. So it was a really big deal. Now that's sort of the machine that Universal Audio is emulating here. They're actually emulating the Mark III of that machine, which came out late 80s. And most everything famous that was ever recorded in the 80s and 90s on tape was using that machine. Not only was that machine based on the microprocessors of the Mark I, you could do all kinds of manipulations to it. It was the cleanest machine, and you could make it colorful, you could make it distort, you could do all kinds of stuff with it, which made it in high demand. So that's what we're working with on the Universal Audio emulation of this. So let's get into it. I'm going to pull up a machine here on the insert. Now we could use the tape extension, but I'll show you why I'm using the insert here in a second. So let's go through some of the controls here. I'm going to start over here with the buttons here that are actually renamed on the plugin here. On the machine, these are your fast forward, rewind, record, play, pause, stuff like that. Let's start with the input though. The input button here emulates the sound of the machine's electronics only. There are no tape sonics on this. So this is the scenario when the machine is in live monitoring mode, but the tape transport is not running. So if you have the machine on and you were listening to just the machine, this is what you would hear through that. That's an interesting, colorful thing you might want to do in a mix. I've never done it, but you could use it for that. The sync mode here is models the sound of the direct recording and playback via the sync record head, which is right in here. That's the machine's electronics plus the sound of the sync head, which is what you would be hearing if you were tracking at the time. Okay, so let's look at the Repro Head. This is the normal operation of this machine in this format here. So we're not really tracking to it. We're not listening to the sync head unless you wanted to use it as an effect that way. We're normally using it as in repro mode. So the repro mode here is the sound of the full signal coming through the record head and the playback through the reproduction head. And that's got all the electronics and everything involved with it here. So this is what we use most of the time. Let's move over here to the tape formulas. From left to right, we have 4 types of tape here. We have the Scotch 250, we have an Ampex 456, We have a Bass F900 and a Quantigy GP9. Now from left to right, those are basically going from oldest to newest tape formulas. Doesn't mean that the oldest is worse or anything like that. It actually has a pretty cool sound to it. I usually use the 250 tape for rock and roll and folk music. If it needs to be a little bit cleaner, you can go this way. GP9 being probably the cleanest with the highest amount of headroom. And that brings me to the Cal switch over here. I'm going to put this back on 250 for a second here. Cal is also confusing to a lot of folks. The Cal level sets what is the proper flux level for a tape type. That's basically the amount of magnetic information being put on the tape. Normally when calibrating a tape machine, you use a reference tape with test tones, etc., to set a proper gain level for the repro, sync, and record heads. And this control only applies to gain levels. That's what this is for. And this is for the types of tape over here. Now, the Cal level refers to setting the output level to the manufacturer's specs. So for instance, the Scotch 250 tape has a manufacturer spec of +3. That would be here on the GUI. And that means that when a test tone is played on the deck, the output gain should be adjusted to show +3 above 0 on the VU meter. The NAB test tapes were all printed at 0 dB, so you knew that the signal you were getting was at 0 dB. So you would calibrate this to above that, and that's how you would get that tape to work correctly on the machine. Scotch tape is +3. 456 tape was a +6. 900 and GP9 are both +9. But we have an extra Cal here because you can calibrate the machine to do different things. Like I can put it on 250 and calibrate it to a +9 if I wanted to. It has a different sound to it, and that's just up to you to see what you like. But the manufacturer specs would be 250 +3, 456 +6, etc. We'll get to calibrating the rest of the machine here in a minute, but this only has to do with gain. Now let's look at the speed right fast. The IPS, inches per second. There's a neat little bypass if you switch it to off. That's one way to just turn it off without hitting the power button. 7.5 inches per second, 15 inches per second, and 30 inches per second. You can think of this as sort of a tone control. The 15 IPS is probably the most common in rock and roll, hip hop, acoustic music, stuff like that. 30 IPS is for classical. I have hardly ever seen people use 30 IPS in real life unless it was a super high-end client who needed that. 15 is probably the most common. 7.5 was used for basically lower budget stuff like blues musicians, some jazz musicians. A lot of jazz musicians use 7.5. It's because it's cheaper. You can put more information on a reel to reel. That way, you have more time before you have to buy a new reel. At 30 IPS, it's just going super fast. So and you'd have to change the reel. That's a good thing about this plugin. We don't have to change reels. Let's now look at the VU meter. The VU meter represents the level of signal after the virtual tape. That's important. This is not an input level. This is after. So it may be useful to use a standalone VU meter plugin before the A800 if you really want to be super particular about a signal going to it. But if you've got, if you've gain staged well, then there should be no issue at all. It's all up to your ear. Speaking of though, this plugin has an internal operating level of -12 dBFS. That means that if I have a signal coming in at -12 dBFS, then it should be hitting about 0 here. If these things are lined up at 0. That would be sort of what you would call a sweet spot of this plugin, although it's not meant to be really used that way. It's meant to be used with the input here, which is, as I said before, is an outside gain. It has nothing to do with the internals of the machine, even though you're pushing more signal into the electronics and the tape by using this. So if your signal is super low, boost it up here. If your signal is super hot, you can boost it down here. It's not going to hurt the plugin. That's good to know. Now let's open the Studer up and we'll take a look at the insides for a second here. We have two sections here, basically a large section here, a large section here on the right side of the plugin. Let's look at this one first, the equalizer. This is an emphasis EQ. The emphasis EQ, depending on which part of the world you're working in, your emphasis EQ curve is going to be different. And it's going to be different on different tape speeds as well, and different formulas. So this is actually two curves. It's a pre-curve and a post-curve that are applied to the signal to deal with noise. There are two types. There are NAB, which is sort of the North American, I believe that stood for North American Broadcast. So the North American EQ emphasis curve here, and the CCIR, which was a European standard. Now, if you go through the manual of this plugin, they will tell you that this is probably the better of the two, although it would not have been used in the United States. If you had a record made in the United States, it would be on the NAB. And if you were in Europe, it would be on the CCR. It has something. It has to do with the type of electrics that are in a building that you're running. So you have like a 60 cycle hum or a 50 cycle hum, and some other things to do with the noise that would come through the electronics of the machine, and some other factors. So this is important for which kind of sound you're going for. We also have a control for the noise. We can turn it on or off. Off is completely off, by the way. If you turn it on and pull the hum or the hiss down, you can still have a little bit. It's like a well-maintained machine around in this area here. But some people don't want any of that noise at all. Just leave it off. Now, this is one thing that confuses some folks with the plugin. We have a cal here, and then we have Autocal here. That seems redundant, but what's going on? The cal here, as I said before, is the gain. It's controlling the gain for the tape type. Autocal here takes care of these settings over here, the high frequency driver, the sync head EQ, the repro head EQ for the tape type, and for the speed. So if we had a hardware machine, I would need to calibrate this machine to the specific speed and the type of tape that is being used. So if you watch over here, if I change this tape type, you will see that the bias is now changed because I changed tape type. The bias has changed again. Sometimes we have a lot of differences between the high frequency drivers and stuff like that. So let me, I'll pull down here to 7.5 and we'll move through those again. You'll see the high frequency driver changed quite a bit on the 456 tape, the 900 tape, the GP9 tape. If I move to the 30 inches per second speed on the tape machine, you'll notice up here that the two lights went out on the EQ emphasis. And that's expected because there is basically one type of EQ emphasis for 30 inches per second. It's the same in North America and Europe, all over the world. So there's no option to change those two. It's only on the 15 IPS and the 7.5 IPS that you can change that on. That's as it would be in the real world. So now let's take a look right fast at these calibration controls here. We have a high frequency driver. This section is an interesting part of the machine. If we have Autocal on, no matter what tape formula I go to or speed I go to, it's going to be calibrated to the manufacturer's specifications for the best use. But that's not always the intended use of the recording engineer. So say for instance, if I have 456 tape here and I want to change the bias to be a little bit over biased, which is pretty common, I need to turn Autocal off. And then I can turn this screw up a little bit. Now, when I turn this screw up and over bias this machine, we are going to lose high frequency content. So this high frequency EQ right here is meant to compensate for that high frequency loss when you over bias a machine. Now, if I start messing with this and get, crazy into a different area and start doing the bias all over the place, trying to find a different sound that I like, I can always go back to Autocal, hit on, and we're back to the setting for that specific tape type. Again, I'm going to turn that off. And if I want to over bias and then roll up a little bit of high frequency, that was pretty common, especially in the drums channels. And you can do this per channel. We'll talk about the ganged controls here in a second, but this is if we just have one instance going. You can do all of this on one channel. So let's look at the sync EQ. The sync EQ is basically the EQ that is being used on the sync head if we're listening to that. The repro EQ is only on the repro head. So if I'm listening to the repro head, I can use this section here to change the high frequency. It's kind of like a shelf, kind of. The low frequency as well. If there's too much low frequency, I can turn it down. If I want more, I can turn it up. Same for the high frequency here. But this high frequency and low frequency doesn't do anything if I'm listening to the repro head. That's only for when I'm on the sync head. So it's actually pretty simple inside of here. We have the bias, the high frequency driver, all together. We have the sync head EQs, the repro head EQs, the noise, and then we have the ability to gang everything, which means that if I have a ton of instances of the Studer across a project, if I hit on, then everything I do down here will affect every other instance of the plugin. And that's pretty common too. You would want everything to be lined up kind of the same way, with the exception of maybe a track or two for the snare drum, or specifically for a bass. Maybe you could EQ or calibrate that particular channel differently if you wanted to. So let's take a listen to a couple examples here. I have on this particular project, this is the rhythm section, the drums and the bass from that song we've been working on from the Wood Brothers on my channel here. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to come over to the insert and I'm going to put in the Studer plugin. Now I'm going to copy and paste that onto all of these channels. Now all of the channels have the Studer machine on them, and the reason I'm not using the tape extension, by the way, is because the tape extension, if I use it and I turn it off and on, it actually takes a second for you to hear the difference. So with the actual plugin in the insert, I can use the through option, and you will immediately not hear the tape, and then I can put it back on repro and we can listen to it immediately with a different tape type or formula or speed. So it's just a matter of speed doing it this way. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to open this up and I'm going to turn on the gang controls, and then I'm going to bypass this machine. I'll do it this way, off. Okay, so I'm also going to open up another instance here, maybe with the bass amp. And you can see that when I do one thing on one track here, it follows it on the other machine. So that's a good way to test out that the gang controls are working. So let's take a listen to this actually first without any tape on it at all. I'm going to turn this off, and this is the sound of the track as it was recorded. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this up on 15 inches per second. We're going to use the 456 tape at the +6, which is where it's supposed to be. And I will toggle this on and off by hitting the through and the repro. So when it's on repro, it's on, and when it's on through, it's not. Pretty subtle difference, but it does add up over time as you're moving through a bunch of tracks, and especially if you have it on buses, etc. It does add up, and we can change things under here to make it add up even more. So let's actually move this over to the 250 tape, and I'm going to put it on 30 inches per second, and we'll try that again. Actually, I feel like that's not very fair, because the snare drum, he's hitting rim shots at the beginning of this. Yeah, and right there he switches to hitting a regular snare drum hit. Let me just start it there, and we'll try that again. So we're off now. Okay, let me back it off to the 7.5 IPS and do the same thing. You feel that little bass bump that comes in at the 7.5 IPS. It's a little bit lower in frequency than it is on the 15 IPS, and it's almost not even there on the 30 IPS. So I will walk through those this time just by moving the speed control here. Okay, cool. Now, as I'd said before, I have Autocal on, so every time I move this speed control, it's calibrating everything inside the machine to be the correct calibration of low frequency, high frequency for that tape type. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to start driving this input some more into the machine. Let's say let's put it up here on about the second mark, and I'll pull it down to about the second mark. That should be about unity gain. And we're going to do the same thing on the 15 IPS. You can start to feel the bass guitar getting pushed down and compressed really hard in there, and that's actually showing on the VU, so it's hitting it pretty hard. This would be a good time to actually turn off the gain controls and set that back to where it was and leave the drum parts on this higher input. Okay, so now I'm going to take the specific track that's the snare drum here. I'm going to make sure that the gain controls are off, and I'm going to start moving this bias up a bit on this particular track. I'm going to over bias it, in other words. Then I'm going to add some of the high frequency back in. And in the mix, that's now going to sound like this. Cool. I'm going to go back to gain controls, and we're going to bypass it and turn it back on. It's like a multi-band compressor almost, and an EQ and distortion all wrapped in one. So now I'm going to come over here to the mix bus, and we're going to take a look at what kind of signal we've got coming out of this thing now. Okay, cool. Now the reason I'm doing that is just to make sure that my gain structure is okay. And I'm going to put on the ATR 102. We're going to listen to this as if it was recorded on hardware on a multi-track machine being printed to a 2-track machine. I'm going to leave it at the default. This is an extremely deep plugin. It takes a while to get used to it, but I'm just going to leave it at the default setting here, and we'll turn it off and then on. Okay, same idea as before. What I'm going to do, I'm going to come up here to the record and the reproduce. These are kind of backwards as to what most people think of them. The record is the input, the reproduce is the output. So I'm going to look at the input VU level of this, and I'm going to put it on through. Actually, no, I'll leave it on repro while we do this. And I'm going to push this into the ATR 102. Okay, so let's take a listen to this whole thing now as it's been recorded through a multi-track machine, the Studer, and being printed to the 2-track machine, I'm going to gain controls here. I'm going to go to through. I'm going to set this on through so that nothing's going through tape first, and then we'll turn them both on. Okay, that's the classic spotlight on the Studer A800. I do recommend using this as the tape extension if you're using UAD's Luna. It takes the processing off the DSP and allows you to run, as many instances as your computer can do. You can use most of the same processing here, and you can bias each channel on its own if you wanted to do the same thing I did with the snare as well. So thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe and the like button, and we'll see you soon.